Well, the latest mass shooting propaganda line just dropped. They did this a few years back, right after Parkland, when they said there had been 18 school shootings in the first month and a half of 2018, until you applied just the slightest touch of scrutiny to their data to see how far they stretched it. Apparently, any gun discharge within a mile radius of a school counted, whether or not it even hurt anybody. In one case, they counted an accidental discharge at a police academy as a school shooting, as though that's the same thing as what happened at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. This time, after the 2 mass shootings in California this week, the new line is 40 mass shootings so far in 2023. That's right. More mass shootings than days this year.
In the first few weeks of 2023, at least 73 people have been killed in 40 mass shootings across the country. There have been more mass shootings than days in 2023.
Now, immediately, if you're paying attention to that math, it should sound suspicious. 73 people killed in 40 mass shootings, so you're telling me the average mass shooting is killing fewer than 2 people? That sounds like we're stretching some definitions quite a bit. Correct. It's a question of what is a mass shooting? What is the definition? And in this case, the definition comes from the Gun Violence Archive, a website that tracks shooting events of all types that I've referenced frequently before because, in addition to mass shootings, they also track defensive gun uses, which are much more common than even their very loose definition of mass shooting, but everyone in media just ignores this side of the issue. Anyway, the Gun Violence Archive defines mass shooting in an unusual way that nobody else does. Their definition reads simply 4 or more shot or killed, as in injured, not necessarily dead, not including the shooter in the same event. GVA acknowledges that methodology is a unique one and produces mass shooting numbers much higher than other sources. And it makes sense this definition would create inflated numbers. If I asked you to define mass shooting just in your own sense, it's very likely you'd think of 2 things. You would think numbers and place. You'd probably say something like a shooting that kills X number of people in a public place like a mall or a school, or a church, or a workplace, something like that. This definition has little to say about either variable. By this definition, a so-called mass shooting is counted in cases of only injury and no death, and there are no location specifics at all. A mass shooting could happen in your living room, for example. And if it sounds weird to have a mass shooting that kills nobody in your living room, that's because it is weird. It's in contrast to the common conception of the term. It's not to say that a shooting in your home where nobody dies isn't a serious criminal issue. It's just to say that's something different than a guy opening fire on random people at a mall. What's happening here methodologically is that events that only fit the common conception of mass shooting on the very fringe edges, if they fit that conception at all, are being categorized as mass shootings to give you the impression that mass shootings are much more common than they actually are. Let's start with the numbers side of this definition. If the average mass shooting, according to this claim, is under 2 deaths, well then in how many of these so-called mass shootings does nobody die at all? I pulled the data, and in the 40 cases they're claiming this year, 15, over a third of the cases, resulted in 0 deaths. Cases of 0 or 1 death account for 26. That's 2/3 of the cases. In other words, most of the cases they are counting as mass shootings do not even include plural deaths. Make just that one constraint to the definition, and you've eliminated 2/3 of their claim immediately. And just to be sure that this January isn't some statistical anomaly, I made the same counts in the 2022 data as well. Same result. Actually, it's slightly more skewed. GVA counts 647 total mass shootings in 2022. Almost half of them, 293, resulted in no death at all. Cases resulting in 0 or 1 death are 490. That's over 3/4 of the so-called mass shootings last year with singular or 0, not plural deaths. Yeah, well, so what? Who cares? That's just like your opinion, man. You say a mass shooting should have multiple deaths. They don't. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. Well, I'm not saying that they're wrong necessarily. I am saying that this methodological choice is an important deviation from how we've analyzed this issue prior. For example, Congress passed a law in 2012 that for crime analytics defines mass killing as 3 or more dead in a single incident. Likewise, the Congressional Research Service, for their policy analytics, defines mass shootings as 4 or more killed, excluding means to an end situations like robbery or terrorism. Now that we've decided to include cases where nobody dies, well, it's unsurprising that we see massive increases in the case count, and that's only one side of the definitional liberties taken. Remember, it wasn't just number dead that we were thinking about in defining mass shooting, it's location or setting too. When analyzing the 40 claimed mass shootings case by case, I noticed a trend. Many of these cases are domestic incidents, killing your whole family type situations. In fact, many of these cases are the larger death counts on the list. Guy in Cedar City, Utah, kills his family of 8. Guy in High Point, North Carolina, same thing, 5 dead. Guy in Cleveland, Ohio, same thing, 4 dead. Again, it doesn't mean these aren't serious, horrific crimes. It just means people tend not to think of events like these as mass shootings because they aren't in a public setting. These are targeted family disputes within the home. So I counted up all the cases in the 40 so-called mass shootings that took place in a home or an apartment or a domestic setting, not a public setting. By my count, there are 13 such cases, meaning a third of the so-called mass shootings were in-home events. So if cases without multiple deaths account for about 2/3 of this 40 number, and cases in homes or domestic settings account for about a third, what happens if we apply these two basic constraints together? Let's say we adopt the federal statutory definition of mass killing, 3 or more deaths, and let's say that shootings in homes are not mass shootings because they aren't in a public setting. If we apply just these two basic constraints, there haven't been 40 mass shootings in 2023. There have been 2. Only the recent shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay, California, the shootings that prompted this alarmist claim in the first place. And it makes sense. If mass shootings are so common, more than 1 per day, well then why did it take until these California shootings toward the end of the month for major media to start covering an issue they love to sensationalize? It's because the prior cases were something different. If they emphasized those cases, you'd realize, I don't know, that doesn't really sound like a mass shooting in the commonly understood sense. So they have to wait until an actual mass shooting and then lump in all these other cases afterwards so that you're primed to think that they're all the same, when in fact they are not. Another reason they likely have less interest in these other cases is their political implications. A significant number of the 40 so-called mass shootings, 19, almost half, are in major urban centers, mostly controlled by Democrats. In many of these places, assault weapons are already banned, carry permits are difficult, if not practically impossible to get, and every other line on the gun control wish list is already in effect. So that's inconvenient. As are the demographics I'm betting they'd rather not discuss. If there are plenty of these so-called mass shootings that result in large injury numbers but low death numbers, that's an indicator of some wild shots. Indeed, many of these mass shooting cases are drive-bys or fights at events between rival groups, as they characterize, and other incidents highly likely to be gang activity. Because these cases are recent, a suspect isn't always identified, but the clues are there. A shooting at a Martin Luther King Day party, a shooting at a basketball court, a shooting at a rap music video set. Well, those are not newsworthy mass shootings. Those are the natural result of systemic racism and socioeconomic factors, of course. All of this is highly inconvenient to the narrative that the reason that we have shootings on the sets of Oakland music videos is because those pesky Arizona ranchers won't give up their guns. That, of course, is the driving purpose behind this coverage. It's the organizing principle behind this entire inflated mass shooting claim in the first place. Surrender to the feds. The NBC News story that prompted me to investigate this claim gives no time to anybody who might discuss the utility of defending yourself from these crimes or the utility of the state's authority to manage this issue for themselves. Instead, it is time only for politicians and activists who will stop at nothing to disarm you. The mayor of Oakland implies it's not her state's fault that there's so much violence. It's the federal government's.
3 of the most recent shootings in California, a state considered to have the toughest gun laws in the nation. But that hasn't stopped the violence.
This problem isn't unique to our state, but it is unique to our nation. This has to end.
Yes, just like Chicago is Indiana's fault, Oakland is Arizona's fault. This according to the official Vox explainer for how it could be that California's strictest in the nation gun laws failed yet again. Of course, the shooters just drive to Arizona to get their guns, or they have them shipped in by the local Arizona gun delivery man. Multiple problems with that explanation. First of all, it lacks evidence entirely in either California case. Nobody has demonstrated that the Monterey Park shooter or the Half Moon Bay shooter's guns came from out of state. Secondly, if they did, that's illegal, not just in California, nationwide. By the federal law they demand to solve the problem, any interstate transfer of a gun requires transport through federally licensed dealers who will administer a federally required background check at the point of receipt and apply all the laws relevant to that state. So can a California resident legally drive over to Arizona, go to a gun shop, buy an AR, walk out with it, and go back to California? No. And the same is true for Chicago and Indiana or any other interstate example. It doesn't matter if you buy it at a shop. It doesn't matter if you buy it at a gun show with all of its supposed loopholes. It doesn't matter if you buy it from a rando on a sidewalk. If you transfer possession of any gun across state lines without the oversight of a federally licensed dealer who will enforce all of the laws within the state of receipt, you have violated federal law. So if you're going to blame other states for crimes in California or Illinois and prescribe additional federal law as the solution, you must explain why existing federal law on interstate gun transfers is not being properly enforced and how that would change under your plan. But of course, it's not about the specifics or the evidence. It's just about the agenda, even if the agenda is completely incoherent. Listen to the dissonance in this NBC News piece itself. Premise 1, we are making progress in passing new gun laws, both federally and in almost half of states.
Nationally, politicians don't often agree on solutions, but the Giffords Law Center points to progress. In 2022, President Biden signed a bipartisan bill that gives grants to states for red flag laws, enhances background checks for 18 to 21-year-olds, and funds mental health services. 21 states and Washington, D.C. passed some kind of bill aimed at gun safety.
But also, premise 2, things are getting way, way worse. 2023 is on a terrible track record of mass shootings, up almost 50% compared to last year.
40 mass shootings across the country, compared to 27 at this point last year.
Well then, how is it progress if the problem is getting worse? It's because progress is not a term to describe improving results in this context. Progress is code for the erosion of your rights. These people will not quit until they've disarmed you fully. It's not the numbers that they care about. Those are just a means to an end. And the end is making you defenseless. Case in point, if mass shootings suddenly dropped to 0 this year, do you think these people would drop their gun control agenda along with it? Of course not. Instead, they'd think of new ways to define the problem and fudge the numbers to justify the gun grab regardless. Peace and tranquility are not the goal. Full control of you is. In other words, these people will not quit until there are plenty more mass shootings at home. Actually, it's just they'll look a lot less like an MLK party and a lot more like Ruby Ridge or Waco. You know, the good kind of mass shooting where the government kicks down your door and takes your stuff to ensure a defenseless population. That is the end of this ideological road. And if it's realized, I suspect, only then will we finally find a definition of mass shooting that doesn't count. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Minds. That is at M.L. Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.